This morning, before making a single cup of coffee, before even looking at my phone, I walked out into the backyard. I picked a small handful of cherry tomatoes still wet with morning dew. I snapped off a few stems of fresh basil so fragrant that my fingers held the smell for the next hour. And I reached into the nesting box and picked up 2 eggs that my hens had laid just before sunrise. 22 minutes later, I sat down in front of a plate of warm bruschetta with fried eggs, fresh tomatoes, and torn basil. No delivery app. No drive-through. No standing in the kitchen wondering what to make. Everything on that plate came from within 10 feet of my back door. And here is the question I want to ask you right now. When was the last time you actually knew where your food came from? Not from reading a label, not from a commercial, but really knew because you grew it yourself, tended to it yourself, and picked it yourself this morning. In today's video, I am going to take you through a real morning on my end. From the moment I step outside at 6 in the morning all the way to the moment I set a plate down on the table at 7. I am going to be honest about all of it, including the things that went wrong, the plants that died, and the failures it took before mornings started looking like this one. And if you are sitting there thinking you do not have a garden or you do not have the time, stay until the end, because I have a perspective that might completely change the way you think about that. If this is the kind of content you want to see more of, go ahead and hit subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. Now let us get into it. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not start growing my own food because I wanted to slow down, or because I saw it trending online, or because someone told me it was a healthier lifestyle. I started because I was frustrated. Genuinely, deeply frustrated in a way that had been building for years without me even realizing it. It started with a bunch of herbs. I bought fresh basil from the grocery store on a Sunday, used maybe 3 or 4 leaves for dinner that night, and by Wednesday the rest of it had turned black in the bottom of my refrigerator drawer. And I stood there looking at it thinking, I just paid $4 for something I used once and then watched die. That happened again the following week. And the week after that. And somewhere around the 15th time it happened, I stopped being annoyed at the basil and started being annoyed at the whole system I had built my meals around. Here is something that stopped me cold when I first read it. The average tomato sold in an American grocery store travels roughly 1800 miles before it reaches your plate. 1,500 miles. It gets picked before it is ripe so it can survive the journey, stored in refrigerated trucks, pass through distribution centers, and by the time it lands on a shelf under fluorescent lights, it has already been in transit longer than most people take vacation. And then we wonder why it tastes like nothing. We wonder why the texture is off. We wonder why the color looks right, but the flavor just does not follow through. It is not a mystery. It is math. According to the USDA, somewhere between Sanger and Sister% of the food supply in the United States gets wasted before anyone even eats it. That means for every 10 bags of groceries that come into American homes, 10 or so of them end up in the trash. I used to be a part of that statistic without even thinking about it. So I made one small change. I bought sand pots, a bag of soil, a packet of cherry tomato seeds, and a small basil plant from a nursery down the street. I put them on my apartment balcony. That was it. No grand plan, no investment in raised beds, no dream of living off the land. Just sand pots and a quiet decision to try something different. And I want to tell you what happened next because it surprised me in a way I was not expecting. It was not the tomatoes that changed things. It was what growing them did to the way I think about food, about mornings, and honestly about how I want to start my day. That is exactly what we are going to get into right now. So let me take you through what an actual morning looks like. Not a highlight reel, not a curated version with perfect lighting and a linen apron. A real morning. Because I think that is where most videos lose people. They make it look so effortless and so beautiful that you end up feeling like you could never do it yourself. And that is exactly the opposite of what I want you to feel right now. I wake up at 6. And the very first thing I do, before coffee, before my phone, before anything else, is walk outside. I know that sounds backwards to most people. But there is a reason for it, and once you try it even once, you will understand immediately. The garden in the early morning is a completely different place than it is at noon. The air is cooler, the light is softer, and every plant is still holding whatever moisture came through the night. That is when the flavors are at their peak. Herbs especially. Basil picked at 6 in the morning has a depth and a brightness to it that the same plant simply cannot give you at 2 in the afternoon. So the rule in my garden is simple. If you want the best of what the plant has to offer, you show up before the day heats up. The first thing I check is the tomatoes. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of picking tomatoes too early because they are afraid something will eat them overnight, or because they look red enough and close enough. But here is the thing about a truly ripe tomato. It does not just look red. It has an even color all the way around. It gives very slightly when you press it gently with your thumb, and in a lot of cases the stem has already started to separate on its own. That is the tomato telling you it is ready. A tomato that is still firm, still a little orange near the top, still clinging hard to the vine, that tomato needs 1 or 2 more days. Patience here is not just a virtue. It is the difference between a tomato that tastes like summer and one that tastes like the plastic bag it came in. After the tomatoes, I move to the basil. And this is something I want you to remember if you grow nothing else. When you harvest basil, always pick from the top down. Take the newest growth at the very tips of the stems, not the older leaves lower on the plant. When you harvest from the top, you are actually encouraging the plant to branch out and produce more leaves over time. Harvest from the bottom, and you are slowly working against the plant natural growth pattern. A basil plant harvested correctly will keep giving you fresh leaves for months. One harvested carelessly will bolt flower and turn bitter within weeks. Then I check the nesting boxes. If you keep backyard hens, you already know that early morning is when the freshest eggs are waiting. But even if you do not keep chickens, and most people watching this do not, I want to tell you what to look for when you are buying eggs with quality in mind. A fresh egg, when you hold it and give it a very gentle shake, will be silent. There is no movement inside. No sound. The yolk is sitting tight and full against the white, and the whole thing feels solid and dense in your hand. An older egg will have a slight slosh to it. That small difference tells you everything you need to know. By the time I come back inside, I have been outside for maybe sheer minutes. I have a small bowl of cherry tomatoes, a handful of fresh basil, and our eggs. And standing at my kitchen counter looking at those 3 things, I already know exactly what breakfast is going to be. No decision fatigue. No scrolling through recipes. The garden made the decision for me, and honestly, that is one of the most underrated gifts this whole practice has given me. And that right there is where things start to get really good, because now it is time to cook. There is a moment that happens in the kitchen when you are cooking with ingredients you grew yourself, and I do not think I can fully describe it until you have experienced it at least once. It is not pride exactly, though there is some of that. It is something quieter than pride. It is more like a sense of completion, like a loop that started weeks ago when you pressed a seed into soil has finally closed right here at this countertop. That is the feeling I want you to understand, and the best way I know how to get you there is to walk you through exactly what I did this morning. The first thing I do when I come in from the garden is set the tomatoes out on the cutting board and slice them in half. Cherry tomatoes, halved. And then I do something that most people skip and should never skip. I sprinkle them with a pinch of good sea salt and drizzle just a small amount of olive oil over the top, and then I leave them alone for about 1 minute. That is it. What the salt does in those 1 minute is quietly remarkable. It draws out the natural liquid from inside the tomato, concentrates the sweetness, and by the time you come back to them, they are sitting in a small pool of their own juice that is more flavorful than any sauce you could buy in a jar. This is not a trick I invented. It is something Italian home cooks have done for generations, and there is a reason it has never gone out of style. While the tomatoes are resting, I put a cast iron skillet on medium heat with no oil, and I lay 2 slices of bread directly onto the dry surface. No butter yet, no oil yet, just bread on hot iron. The sound it makes after about a minute is one of those kitchen sounds that makes everyone in the house quietly appear in the doorway. When both sides are golden and there are dark grill marks across the surface, I pull them off and rub each slice immediately with a raw garlic clove. The heat from the bread opens up the garlic just enough to leave behind a whisper of flavor without being sharp or overpowering. Then I add a small drizzle of olive oil right onto the surface of the warm bread and let it soak in for just a moment. Now the eggs. I add a small pour of olive oil to the same skillet, drop the heat down to low, and crack both eggs in gently. No lid. No rushing. Low and slow is the only way to cook an egg if you want the white to be fully set, while the yolk stays completely liquid in the center. I know some people prefer their yolks cooked through, and that is entirely a personal choice. But for this dish, for this particular morning, a yolk that breaks open across warm bread and mixes with the tomato juice underneath is not just a preference. It is the whole point. When everything is ready, I build the plate in layers. Toasted bread first, then a generous spoonful of the salted tomatoes and their juice spread across the surface, then the fried eggs laid on top, and finally the basil torn by hand directly over everything. Not chopped, torn. Tearing releases the oils in the leaves differently than a knife does, and the aroma that comes off it in that moment is something that no grocery store herb, no matter how fresh it claims to be, can replicate. A few cracks of black pepper over the top, and that is it. From the moment I stepped outside to the moment I sat down at the table, our minutes had passed. And, sitting there looking at that plate, knowing exactly where every single element came from, I felt something I want you to feel too. Not just satisfaction with the food, but a quiet kind of clarity about the morning. Like the day had already given me something real before it had even really begun. I want to talk about what actually shifts when you start living this way, because I think most people expect the benefits to be about nutrition or money or some kind of measurable output. And while those things do change over time, the changes that surprised me most were not the ones I was looking for. They were quieter than that, more personal, and in some ways more lasting than anything I could have tracked on a spreadsheet. The first thing that changed was the way I eat through the seasons. When your food comes from the ground outside your door, the garden sets the menu, not the other way around. In summer, it is tomatoes and basil and zucchini and peppers. In fall, it shifts towards squash and kale and root vegetables. And what I noticed, without trying or planning for it, is that my body started to follow that rhythm naturally. I stopped craving things that were out of season. I stopped reaching for strawberries in January or corn in March. Not because I forced myself to stop, but because I had something better, something real and immediate and alive, waiting for me right outside. That is a shift that happens slowly and then all at once. And when it does, you realize how disconnected from natural cycles most of us have been living without even noticing it. The second change was how dramatically my food waste dropped. Before I started growing anything, I was part of that statistic I mentioned earlier, buying more than I used, watching things go soft in the refrigerator, throwing away money alongside the food. When you grow something yourself, you harvest exactly what you need for that meal. There is no excess because there is no mindless buying. You walk outside, you look at what is ready, and you take only what you are about to cook. According to my own rough tracking over the past year, I have reduced the food I throw away by somewhere around 6%. That is not a small number. That is a real shift in the way resources move through a household. The third change is the one I talk about least because it is the hardest to explain to someone who has not experienced it. Those sheer minutes outside every morning before I look at a screen have become the most important sheer minutes of my day. Not because of what I accomplished during them, but because of what they do to the rest of everything that follows. There is something about putting your hands in your soil, about paying attention to something living and growing and unhurried, that resets the nervous system in a way that no app, no meditation timer, No morning routine content on the internet has ever replicated for me personally. I am not telling you it will work the same way for you. I am telling you it works for me, consistently, every single morning, and that alone would have been worth every failed plant and every bag of soil I ever bought. And I think that points to something larger that is worth saying out loud. The farm-to-table movement, the garden-to-table lifestyle, the slow food philosophy, none of these are new ideas. They are not trends that appeared on social media in the last few years. Human beings ate this way for thousands of years before the modern food system was built around convenience and scale. What is new is that people are actively choosing to return to it, not out of necessity, but out of something that feels more like longing. A longing for connection to where food comes from, for the satisfaction of making something real with your hands, for mornings that feel grounded before the noise of the day begins. And if any part of what I just said resonates with something you have been feeling, I think you already know what the next step looks like for you. So let us bring this full circle. This morning started with a walk outside before the day had a chance to pull me in any direction. It started with wet grass and the smell of basil and 2 eggs still warm from the nesting box. And it ended, RCR minutes later, with a plate of food that I understood completely, from the soil it grew in, to the pan it cooked in, to the table I sat down at. No mystery ingredients, no miles of cold storage, no guessing. Just food that was alive this morning and is now part of me this afternoon. And here is what I want you to take away from all of this. You do not need a large yard. You do not need experience. You do not need to overhaul your entire life or commit to some version of homesteading that feels overwhelming from the outside. What you need is one small thing to start with, and I mean that literally. This week, just this week, I want to challenge you to do one thing. Go find a basil plant at your local nursery or grocery store. They usually cost somewhere between sand and wood dollars. Bring it home, set it on your windowsill or right next to your kitchen door, and use it in the very next meal you cook. That is the whole challenge. One plant, one meal, one small moment of connection between what grows and what you eat. Because every single person I have ever met who now lives this way started with something just that small. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever grown something yourself and eaten it the same day? What did that feel like? Or maybe you are just starting out and you have a question about where to begin. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I make it a point to respond within the first 48 hours because those early conversations are genuinely some of my favorite parts of running this channel. If you found something useful in this video, sharing it with one person who you think might need to hear it is honestly the most meaningful thing you can do. And if you want to come back next week, I am going to walk through exactly how to set up a beginner garden in a small space, even if all you have is a balcony and a few hours on a Saturday morning. Hit subscribe and you will be the first to know when that one goes live. I will leave you with this. The best meal you will ever eat is not necessarily the most expensive one, or the one at the nicest restaurant, or the one someone else cooked for you on a special occasion. The best meal is the one where you know exactly where every single thing on that plate came from. And that meal, it turns out, can start with nothing more than a seed, a little patience, and a willingness to step outside before the rest of the world wakes up.